The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jenny James, Director at Insource, and I'll be hosting today's webinar. Also joining me today is Stuart McNaught, our Healthcare Product Manager. Stuart will most definitely be answering any technical questions that you may have during the session. Before we kick off, though, a little bit of housekeeping. You should hopefully be able to see a slide on the screen, Patient Pathway Plus Introduction. If you're having any issues seeing the presentation, have a look at the Help facility in the GoToWebinar control panel menu options. This morning's webinar, we're planning for it to last no more than 45 minutes. We are recording it, and we'll send a recording out after the session. We've included time within that 45 minutes for a Q&A, and we'll hold that at the end. We've kept everybody on mute for now, just to minimize background noise and any interference that we might get. So if you do get a question during the session, type it into the questions box on the GoToWebinar control panel on your screen. That way we can address as many questions as possible at the end of the session. If we do have too many questions and we run out of time, we can pick up with each of you individually after the webinar. After the broadcast, we'll send you a link to the recording of the session. Please feel free to share that with any of your colleagues who might be interested, and ask if you'd like a copy of the slides that we're going to show first. We'll be happy to share them with you. We'll also follow up with you to garner any feedback from the session afterwards as well. So without further ado, let's get started. So as I said, my name's Jenny James. I'm a director at Insource, but who are Insource? For those of you who aren't terribly familiar with who we are, we're a data management company. We've been in business for getting on for 25 years now. And here's a selection of some of our clients. As you can see, there's a lot of NHS organisations within there, and we work very closely with our customers to develop all of our products. And many of our staff are ex-NHS as well, including Stuart, who joins me today. So we hopefully understand some areas of your business, and we work very closely with our customers to develop our solutions going forward. Now, the customers we see on this list use a wide variety of some of our data management solutions, but we're going to focus in on one area specifically this morning, which is managing patient pathways, patient tracking, and also RTT validation. So to start, let's look at what do we do today. Well, if I've got in my trust, say, 30,000 open pathways, which is not unusual in some of our organisations that you guys are working in, then how do I manage that? That's a lot of patients waiting for treatment or being dealt with. What do I do today? Well, from the trust that we've dealt with over the years, we've found a number of different ways that people are doing that today. We find a plethora of Excel spreadsheets, fixed reports, or paper-based systems. And it's interesting that we provide the most advanced medical systems and devices to our frontline services, technologies that could only have been dreamt of just a few years ago. And yet we back them up with archaic administration methods that are inefficient and don't help our staff work with the demand that they face. And this results in surprises. There are numerous examples of trusts that suddenly face, long waiters that they knew nothing of because maybe there'd been a little hiccup with the PAS system, or unpredicted breaches of the 18-week rule as pathways appear apparently out of nowhere. And that means that you're missing patients. And this is people that we're talking about. And we want to make sure that we don't lose anyone in the process. So what does good look like? Let's skip ahead. A trust that is at the top of its game has control over the process, so we can never miss patients, We're clear on how to get patients through the system and be provided with the best care at the earliest opportunity. We can adapt. When change comes, whether it's change in demand, whether it's targets, staffing, you know, we've seen with Brexit an impact on staffing, we can adapt to that. Our processes can be backed up with systems that are flexible enough to embrace change and provide support down the line. And we can identify process improvements, and the systems are right there supporting us all the way along. And we have that evidenceable and audited data that's instantly accessible. So we've got confidence in the information that we're providing back to NHS England and internally, confidence that we're not missing anyone. And then finally, we can see data quality issues and we can deal with them early on. So how would we get from the first part of having disconnected issues, and why is a spreadsheet a bad thing anyway? A lot of people have a spreadsheet or a paper-based or a reporting system solution, but why is that bad? Well, it's not bad in the sense that a spreadsheet will give you a view of your current position, but your position changes. And as you have the need for multiple people to work together to move patients through the system, then you need multiple people to enact on that data. So your spreadsheet's only right at one point in time. Similarly with your reporting and your paper-based systems, what you can't do with those is have interactivity. You can't give people actions. You can't have a workflow process. It's a point-in-time reporting approach. So how do we change that to be something that's more interactive, agile, and give us that top of its game trust? Well, in a number of ways. You can automate the acquisition of the pathway data into a single hub, a single patient tracking application. And that can automatically have regular data updates. You can provide interactivity. So everybody, whether you're a medical secretary, whether you're a validator, whether you're a clinician, can see the same information at the same time. And you can refresh that using your local rules that you've created. You can check quality of the data and give you confidence that what's being presented is truly representative of the trust permission. And also gets rid of any unwanted surprises. So what's needed is an automated method. It gives you a choice. If you to replace that Excel spreadsheet behind here, look at a pathway, look at your cohorts of pathways, identify what the next action needs to be. Create an action, assign it to somebody, and have them deal with it in a timely manner. It's flexible enough to give you a smooth transition from that disconnected system that you have today and embrace change when improvements are identified over time, which we see a lot with the trust that we work with, where we start maybe replacing the paper-based system that we have today, and then over time, continuous improvement of the process itself to improve the efficiency and the effectiveness as we go forward. So no patient or no pathway gets lost. So enough of the background. And I don't know about you, but death by PowerPoint is never fun. Let's dive straight into the application and take a look. So here's Patient Pathway Plus. What do I see? A few things. One up here on the top right, I'm a patient tracker. That's who I'm logged in as. So I'm going to be performing the role of a patient tracker during this demonstration, and probably put a few other hats on as we go through the process. And we have an application here that started its life to support the validation process for RTT and has moved on over time into being much more of an interactive patient tracking tool to enable you to use this to run your PTL in many of the trusts we work with, to give you that trustworthy, confident data that you can work with. That has value for both the validators then and the patient trackers. So what do we see here on the home screen? We have 3 panels. On the left-hand side, we've got some buttons for navigation that we'll be using throughout the demonstration this morning. In the center, some statistics for you to see your position at a glance. And on the right-hand side, pathway posts. This is general activity within the application. It could be for administrators to tell you when things are going to be changed, like an upgrade or any downtime. But let's start with the core of the application, looking at patient tracking validation list. So what might I want to do with my hat on of I'm a patient tracker? Well, I want to do a couple of things. I'd like to look at who is there? What are my open pathways? You know, when I mentioned earlier 30,000 open pathways, I think in my demo system here I've got about 35,000 open pathways. Well, that's an awful lot. And how do I start? Where do I see the wood from the trees? And there's a number of different ways to do that. On this screen, where we're going to look at a high level, we can do that in a number of different ways. So on the left-hand side here, we've got some stats. And you'll see as we go through the demonstration, these change based on the data that we're showing, based on the filters that I apply to my data. And then at the top in the center here, there's some filters. And this allows me to choose which pathways that I want to work with. So that narrows down those 30,000 pathways to what's of interest to me today. And then at the bottom, there'll be a list of individual pathways to work with. So where do we start? I want to home in on a cohort of pathways to work with. Maybe it's your specialty that you work in. Maybe, you know, all the open pathways, the ones waiting activity, those different types of things. And then the second part of that is what needs to be done and setting actions to do that. So let's imagine, for the sake of argument, that I'm in the cardiology specialty and I want to have a look at pathways that could have a potential breach this month. Now perhaps I need to validate and check. So let's filter for cardiology. You'll see I've got all of my specialties within here, and this is completely configurable for each of our customers. So all of these drop-down filters are configurable for you. I will quickly set up another couple of filters. For today, I'll just look at RTT pathways, but we could look at all pathways as well. And I'll have a look at open periods. And breach date of this month. Interestingly, these date fields that we have in here, I could put today, next week, next month. They're very, very flexible so that we can use natural language to do our search, which makes it much simpler for the users to use themselves and to get that user acceptance. So I've done the search there, and that's brought back a list of pathways. Interestingly, the very first one on the list, Muller here, is going to breach this month, in fact in a couple of days. That pathway is highlighted red. What does that mean? That means that there's an error somewhere in the events. So let's have a look at the detail and see what's gone wrong here. So click to drill in, and that opens up that particular record for Miss Chanel Muller. And at the top of the screen, there's the details of the patient specifically. And then there's a number of tabs at the bottom showing things like the pathway events here. We can see the activity that spawned those events, directly from the PAS or EPR application. So we've pulled these directly from there to construct the pathway for this particular patient. And what we can see from looking at those pathway events is the first definitive treatment has occurred. So that would ordinarily mean that the pathway would be closed by now once the first treatment has occurred. So we might want to go and review that in the PAS and check it and realize it needs closing. So we'll do that, we'll close that, and then we'll record here what we've done. To do that, I'm just going to click on this button that says validate and open up my validation screen. Well, what does that do for me? Well, it gives me two things. It allows me to track what I've done with some validation notes, so what I did. So in this case, I validated the pathway and it's closed due to treatment received. And I could, if I wanted to, on the right-hand side here, assign a follow-up action if I need to. I don't for this particular one because I've closed it. So I don't need a follow-up action. So I'll just hit save and validate, and that will record the event, but not any actions. So how do I see that I've done that? Well, in a number of ways, as you might imagine. So if I look in the events section, I'll see the date and timestamp and the user ID. As you saw, I'm user patient tracker. So it will come up with my name within there. So then you've got the visibility and the traceability of who's done what. So let's go back to our main screen now. We'll see the effect of the change on our list. Muller's disappeared. So now I can move on. That's not in the list of open things that need to be dealt with. I can also, if I want to, I can have a look at things that have been validated. Let's have a look at validated today. See who's been updated. And here you see the second item. Some of my colleagues are busy working in here as well. You'll see the items that have been validated today as well. Okay, so moving on. Let's go back and have a look at our list again. Again, Muller's disappeared. Let's have a look at the next person in our list. Well, let's work down. That's one way of working through my pathway list. So pick the next one. And just for the sake of argument, as this is a demonstration, let's assume that we've checked and this chap, Mr. Rothschild, needs a diagnostics appointment. So again, we're going to go and validate that we've done that. Book diagnostics in the validation. And in this case, I do want to record an action. Now I can choose a follow-up date. By default, I've got my system set up to remind in 2 weeks' time, but that could be changed. I can update that myself, or I can just leave it as the default, which I will for now. Now, what type of action might I want to follow? I've got some ones set up in here in our demonstration environment, but again, as I mentioned earlier, these are completely configurable. So you can add whatever makes sense for you. So let me set a book diagnostics. Now, who do I want to do that? Now, this is very interesting. I can set that to a specific user. So that could be me, but I'm going to follow that up myself. Or I could set it to a group. So maybe my booking services team, which would make sense. So I'm going to assign it to those guys. And as this is a demo, I'm not going to be very specific. Okay. So in this way, we can do actions as well. So we've identified the cohort, we've picked what needs to be done, and we've set an action. And we can see, although that action's not assigned to me, I can see what they are anytime I want to. So for example, if I just reset all my filters here, and if I have a look at the next action, is to book diagnostics, let's search for anybody in there. And here we go, here's Mr. Rothschild down here that we've just set his book diagnostics. And this is really useful because I now have a list of specific actions as well. So if I decided that, this afternoon, I'm going to spend my afternoon doing all my diagnostics bookings, well, here's a simple place where I've got them all in one place. I can just work through them, get all of those booked in and get those letters sent out. And it makes that a much more efficient process than skipping around between different activities. But there's other things that we could look for in here. It's an extremely configurable application. So we've got lots of filters that we can search on. So for example, if you work on the basis of, well, let's look at the 14 to 18 weeks, and then let's look at 10 to 14, we can simply do that looking at the periods, start and end week. Let's look at 14 to 18 and see who's in there. The way that these filters are enabled means that you can work whichever way you want to work, and that means specialty by specialty may work in a different way. Well, that's great. We can enable that and give you something configurable to fit each part of the organization, each role, and each specialty. There's a few other things that we can look at. Let's look at patient pathway cohorts. So again, we've got some filters that look for specific types of activities. And these, as you might expect, are all completely configurable to how you work. So things like if we've got duplicate pathways, we've got long diagnostic waits, something simple like we've got one or more DNAs, but the period's still open. Depending on how your specific trust works with DNAs, whether you push people back to their GPs after 1 or 2 or more, then you can configure the application to suit exactly that scenario. So let's have a look at those. And in brackets behind each of these is the number of pathways that sit under that cohort. So I'll see I've got 564 people in that cohort. And let's have a look at that. That's all up. And we'll see those people here. And again, we looked at red pathway IDs earlier. These are all red, but they could be blue or black as well, which we saw right at the very beginning. A red pathway, as I mentioned before, is where there's an error in the pathway event. So something like maybe a duplicate clock start or activity without a clock start. A blue highlight here would be where the pathway is in one or more of our cohorts, which would indicate there's an issue, but there's actually no error in the pathway. And a black one, there's no errors and no, they're not in a cohort. So let's have a look at one of these. We'll notice that it's very similar to before, and we've got an extra tab for the potential DQ errors. So we can look at those. We can see which cohort we're in. And again, if we look at the pathway, we've got error duplicate clock start, and we can see the appointment cancelled and the DNA within there. So we might want to add an action, a follow-up action on this. Again, we did that to start with using the validation screen, but we can simply add an action as well if we look at the actions themselves. And again, as I mentioned before, these are all configurable. So I'll just set a reminder. I'll leave it set to myself, and let's add something new. Now, if I want to, I can use this auto text feature, this button here. So if I've got standard text that I use all the time, to save me typing the same things, chase to the F pathway should close. Then I can do that. If I save that, that will create a new action then. So how do I know that I need to follow up that action? My first one that I created earlier to book diagnostics went to a different group, went to my booking team, but this action I set for myself, where does that appear? Well, that's where this diary icon comes in very handy, because we can see, because it's in a big red circle, how many outstanding actions that I have. And that's a very useful place to start, because that's your list, your work list for the day. And then we can work through any of these actions that we want to. And get to the details. This is exactly the one that we want to work on. If I want to go back and have a look at the pathway itself, I've got these 3 dots here. I can go back and have a look at all of those events all over again. So I can get to all of my detail whenever I want to. Let's say I've done that, I've called the person, so maybe log an event. So we can associate the events then with the actions. So we tie that together, and we have that audit trail that we mentioned earlier, where we had the audit trail for what things I'd done in terms of validations. Here we're auditing exactly what's taken place. So maybe it's just a note that I'm going to add. And again, some notes as we're in a demo. And again, in all of these places, I've got the ability to use the auto text feature if I want to. Let's save, complete that action. And then I've gone down from 16 to 15 in my list of actions. So that one's disappeared from my to-do list. Okay, that's gone for my diary. Let's go back to the home page. So far, we've looked at the patient tracking list and validation process to access the cohorts. We've had a look at actions and events and the workflow that we can use around that, so we can decide our next actions, we can record what we're doing, we can assign actions to our colleagues within the organization. Now, if I reassign an action, so when I'm in an action, I can actually say, well, this isn't me, I'll give it to somebody else to work on. Then that's also tracked if I reassign an action. So we've got that full audit trail at every stage of the process. And you could go and see, every time I get this type of action of closing a pathway, I always reassign it to somebody. And then that can help you then when you're looking at process improvement in the future. What this essentially does then is make sure that you don't miss anyone. What we do is we connect to the PAS or EPR to pull all of the data out, regardless of the rules that are set up. We pull out the raw data, construct that into the pathways so that you can see everything in one place. And everybody that accesses that application, the Patient Pathway Plus application, whether it's the clinician, as I mentioned earlier, the validator, the medical secretary, they're all accessing the same data. They get to see the same things, and they get to update those in real time. And we design and configure this application to fit the workflow for your organization. And all of those screens that we've seen, all of our list screens and our cohorts and our filter lookups, they're all configurable. So if I've got some standard columns here to view when I was looking at my patient data earlier, if in your specialty you'd like to see something different, and they're fields that we hold, we can show that differently. So it can be very flexible to suit the organization as a whole. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. It's very, very flexible. And again, we can configure those cohorts so it works with the way that you work in your organization. What else do we cover? Just a couple of things before we wrap up the demonstration. I won't talk about changing passwords, that's dull. But reporting. Reporting is very important in two ways. One, we look at Unify returns and the Scottish MMI returns as well. We can produce those extracts directly from the Patient Pathway Plus application. So it gives you a lights out way of running those that don't mean that you have to return to IT to work on it. So for example, I've looked on here that I clicked in on, that's one I've created before, True Blue Peter style. And this is all of my pathways that I want to include in my submission. And you'll see we've put them into their weight bandings automatically, and I can drill in, as you might expect, as we've done this a few times, to see the details. And you'll see that this person is actually excluded from the extract. We have to give a reason, and we have to say who it's authorized by and the date. So again, we're back to that audit trail of being able to have that audit throughout the process. And then we can use this to create that extract that goes straight to NHS England or NHS Scotland. And then what other reports might you want? Well, we provide a bunch out of the box, and I'll show you a couple of those now. And we can also connect to any existing reporting tools that you may have. So for example, if you're using Click in your organization, as many of our customers are, then you can connect Click directly to Patient Pathway Plus to create reports in there. And I've got in here just a button that could link to your PAS. So for example, here, Track Care, to fire that up without you having to leave the screen. Let's have a look at a couple of those reports quickly, just to give you a view of what's in there. So we've divided them into a number of different sections. Some performance over time, clock starts, and these are all based on things that our customers have asked for over time. And it's really your starter for 10. Hopefully it gives you 80–90% of the reports that you'll need on a day-to-day basis, so like my diary action list and so on and so forth. But also you can add your own local reports if you want to as well. So you can extend the reports that are provided. So for example, if I just pull one up here at random, then we've got some standard reports that we can use that are our clock starts over time, split down into our different specialties as well, so that we can use those. And these can be then put straight into your reporting and performance packs. And if I hit printer friendly version, it will give me a nice grayscale version that's split into different pages so that it will print properly on your local printers as well. So we've taken care of that too. So we've covered a number of different areas then. We've looked at the reporting last, we've looked at the cohorts, validation and tracking processes, actions and events. And I think at this point, it's probably the best thing to do would be to open that up and look at our list of questions that have come in while we've been on the call. So one question that we've got come in is, can we provide any capability for accessing other systems? So we've talked about PAS, but what other systems could we access? Well, let me pass this one over to Stuart. He's our healthcare product manager. The answer is yes, obviously, but what kind of other systems might we want to access, Stuart?
Well, we have the ability to call to other systems, for example, your radiologies, your pathologies, your RIS systems, to be able to get diagnostic testing and information with regards to that as well. So hopefully that will help answer that question.
Yeah, excellent. Another question here, susceptibility to hacking. That's a really good question. How do you provide patient record security? Well, interestingly, this application, we're typically installing it in the trust. So we can offer it as a hosted service, and we have N3 network compatibility to provide that. So we've been through that certification. But most often, I'd say almost all of our trusts are operating with that as an on-premise solution. So you have the option of having it hosted on the N3 network, but we've pretty much mostly gone with on-premise. So hopefully that answers that question. Another question that's come up as well is, can the application support an integrated community or ACS type community? So more than one trust. And yes, we can. So for example, you could be just running one hospital on this. At Salford, they're implementing on 2, Salford and Pennine, and we'll see that more and more as time goes on. And not just looking at the trusts, we'll be seeing, as we get more and more into our integrated care networks, being able to do that end-to-end so that we see primary and secondary and even mental health in the future joining together. So yes, we definitely can, and we'll see more and more of those going forward. I have another question. Are we on any frameworks for procurement? The answer is yes, we're on the G-Cloud framework, which we've seen, it was obviously set up for cloud-hosted applications, but we've seen that be useful even if you're implementing internally on-premise in your own private cloud, is the way that some organizations have got around that. Disaster recovery, are you cloud-based? Oh, I think we may have answered some of that, where we can be hosted on N3 or on-premise, but also some of our customers, we typically would recommend that you have 2 environments, even if it's just one for testing and one for production, and the test environment can be used then as a disaster recovery in the event that you need to. Or some organizations have even considered having the option to have a backup as a hosted environment for in case things go really horribly wrong. One more question. Do we do any predictive modeling? That's probably when we come to reporting and some of those reports we looked at, Stuart, that's one to throw at your direction.
Thank you for that one. At the moment, the product does not do predictive modeling. However, we're always progressing, and we've literally just been developing a new predictive modeling attachment to Patient Pathway Plus that analyzes successful pathways and compares them against your existing ones, and offers you the ability to be able to see if we're falling behind on schedule and give you advice on what the next tasks will be.
Oh, that would be really interesting. Look forward to that. And we'll be working with customers as we roll that out to develop it ongoing. Okay, I think we have 2 more questions to go for. One is, can we apply to non-healthcare apps? So, for example, lost immigration records. That's an excellent question. And I think being able to connect to other applications that we talked about earlier, with diagnostics and radiology, as long as we can get access to another application and we know what the data is that we want to get and how to connect that, then yeah, technically there's no reason why we shouldn't. We just typically will work with each trust to understand the requirements and make sure that we can get access to the data is generally the hardest thing. And then how that ties in to the pathways that we have. What's our unique identifier? And the final question, can we implement this to individual specialties? Yes, of course. And we quite often see different specialties wanting to have different screen layouts, different configuration of the application, so that they can work differently from the rest of the trust, if you like. And certainly we see different reports for different parts of the organisation as well. And just finally on that question on individual specialties. When we're implementing Patient Pathway Plus, it's probably worth just quickly mentioning, we'll propose a phased implementation. So install the application, load your data, and get a visibility of the data. That often will, maybe I should say always, it will always bring up some issues with the data. There's no getting away from the fact that when you load up all of your data into Patient Pathway Plus, you're going to have visibility of all of your data, but you can have visibility of all your data and all of your data quality issues. So there's always a little bit of work to be done as we load everything up and look at it, and then start to roll out. And different organizations do that in different ways. We can start with the central team. So say if there is a central team that's data quality or performance management, we'll often see before we go out to the specialties themselves and out to the wider trust, or work on those data quality issues and then roll out to everybody else. It's really a horses for courses type of implementation. But in terms of timescales, that first phase of getting the solution in and loading up your data, that's 15 days, something like that. So that's a very quick process to be able to have the confidence that you've got the data. Then we start working on training everybody, figuring out how they like the system to be configured, and so on and so forth. So an overall implementation could be as short as 6 weeks, could be 6 to 9 months, depending on the size and scale of that implementation. So hopefully that answers that question. And I think we're 3 minutes ahead of our planned 45-minute session. So be very delighted to close the webinar at that point. I think we've now covered all of the questions. So as I said earlier, we will be sending everybody a copy of the recording of the webinar. Please feel free to distribute that to any of your colleagues that you'd like to. And my colleagues will be following up for feedback from the presentation. So please do let us know if there's anything else that you'd like covered in future webinars. We plan to hold a whole series of them over the rest of this year. So please let us know what you'd like to cover. And anybody that would like to schedule a meeting to go into more detail in your specific instance and your trust and how you'd like to work, then please do get in touch. I quickly do our final slide. So we'll send the slides if you'd like the slides as well. And please do get in touch on our main number there, 0203 727 4200, or please do get in touch with me on email, on LinkedIn, on Twitter. And have a fabulous rest of the day. And we look forward to catching up with you after the event. Thanks for attending.